Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Robin Lerner. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Events here at Charles E. Smith Life Communities. We are so happy to have you here for our program on the effects of trauma on older adults. Just a little bit about Charles E. Smith Life Communities. I know many of you know us, but for those that do not, we deliver quality care, meaningful service, meaningful experiences, personally tailored to those who serve, no matter where they are in life's journey. Our full suite of care and services available on campus include independent living, assisted living, memory care, post-acute care, long-term care, and primary care with a focus on older adults at Hirsch Health Center. To learn more about our campus and our services, you can visit our website, www.smithlifecommunities.org, and we'll put that in the chat for you, and it'll be in our follow-up email. A few other things. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Optum and Minkoff. We appreciate their partnership, and it's through their generosity that we're able to provide so many of these programs at no cost to our community. As I've mentioned, this program qualifies for one Category 1 continuing education unit for social workers. I will say this one more time. Please make sure that the name that you are logged in with on Zoom is the name that you use to register online so that we can confirm your attendance. I will be sending out a follow-up email this afternoon with a SurveyMonkey evaluation. Please complete that and get that back to us within the week. You'll see the deadline in the email, and then we'll get you your certificate confirming your participation. We are recording this program, and the recording will be on our website in the resources section in our videos. We have videos available of almost all of the different programs that we've done recently. Today, we're going to be talking about trauma. And before I go on, I did want to point out that it is a heavy topic, and we understand that. And if you're feeling overwhelmed at any point in this program and you feel like you need to take a break, please feel free to step away for a few minutes and come back to join us. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Annette DelCanto-Ellington is a licensed social worker and a psychotherapist who has been practicing for more than 20 years. She works with adults of all ages, focusing on trauma and its many impacts on clients' lives, including their physical, mental, neurological health, and their relationships with school, work, and loved ones. DelCanto-Ellington has a particular interest in trauma's relationship to cognitive decline after having cared for her mother for more than 10 years until her eventual death from complications of Alzheimer's disease. DelCanto-Ellington will provide an overview of trauma, signs and symptoms, and its relationship to depression, cognitive decline, and anxiety, and what we can do to help ourselves and the ones we love. Without further ado, Annette, it is a pleasure to have you here. This is going to be an interview format, so I am going to be asking Annette a series of questions. She will be providing answers. If you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the chat, and we will get to those questions following the presentation. So Annette, let's start with the basics. Can you tell us what is trauma?
Yeah, hi, Robin. I just want to say thank you for having me today. So in answer to your question, people sometimes think of trauma as an overwhelming, threatening thing that happens to you. But for the purposes of this talk, we are going to call that a traumatic event. Trauma itself is actually an overwhelming stress response in the nervous system to a threatening event that can't be swiftly processed out of the body. So when a traumatic event occurs, the nervous system responds with a surge of protective stress hormones that's designed to spur us into protective action. And that would be fight or flight, which probably most of you have heard of. And these are sympathetic responses, meaning they come from the sympathetic system in our nervous systems, and they are responses of mobilization or upregulation in the nervous system. So by taking that protective action, okay.
I'm so sorry. If someone, please make sure that you're muted. I apologize.
That's okay. I'm wondering if it was recording before, or did it just start recording?
No, I think we're okay. Go ahead. Okay. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Okay. So anyway, so by taking the protective action that the stress hormones spur us into doing, we end up discharging those stress hormones from our body, and our body consequently calms back down. And then, so we call this a parasympathetic downregulation. So the uptick is a sympathetic upregulation, And then the calming back down is a parasympathetic downregulation. But if we can't discharge those stress hormones, the stress response from our body in a timely manner for whatever reason, or maybe we can't discharge enough of them, then whatever is not discharged remains in the body, causing us to experience the event as if it's still happening, as if it's still a threat. We may cognitively know that the event has passed, but our system doesn't experience it that way. We remain in that sympathetic arousal uptick to whatever degree those stress hormones are not discharged. And the longer it remains there unprocessed out of the body, the more embedded into our nervous system it becomes. And the more our system actually buys in that there really is still a threat out there. So then it becomes even harder to process that trauma response out of our system. So that is trauma. It's what is left in the nervous system from the trauma response when the traumatic threat is over. So the traumatic event happens, we have a trauma response, and then we process it out through the action we take. But if it's not all dispersed, then what is left in our system is what we call trauma. And also I want to say that besides fight or flight, there are two other forms of threat response that can happen. And they're both forms of immobilization. So where fight and flight or mobilization, these are immobilization. And they are freeze and collapse. So in this case, if a threat is too big and the system is particularly overwhelmed and the right protective action is ambiguous, then the system will go into a down regulation called freeze, which is a type of shutdown that causes a person to become very still. Or if the event is even more overwhelming, then the system will go even further into shutdown, and this is called collapse, which is basically freeze on overdrive. And collapse may cause a person to dissociate or pass out. So freeze and collapse are activated by the dorsal vagus nerve, which is our oldest defense system. It's about like 500 million years old. Then a couple more things I want to say here is that non-traumatized people will have an uptick in stress hormones when experience a stressful event, of course, but once the event is over, they return to normal. Trauma is what happens when the return to normal is not forthcoming, because the stress response is still stuck in the body. And it's important to note that sometimes the culprit of trauma is not one big event, but maybe many smaller events that over time all add up. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot to digest. You spoke a little bit just now about trauma and the response of the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, okay, so in basic terms, just a second, a lot of talking. In basic terms, a fight response makes us move toward what is happening to take direct protective action. Flight makes us get away from danger, and freeze, like I talked about, is a state that happens in the nervous system when the most protective choice of what to do is unclear and the person literally freezes, like becomes very still, immobilized. And collapse may make us shut down to the point of actually playing dead, like going into a death phase. What I want to stress is that no matter which response we have, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or collapse, that is all outside of our control. It happens lightning speed and is automatically generated by the autonomic nervous system. And so right here, I want to talk a little bit about social engagement. The most evolved parts of our brains are wired for connection and for communal survival. So earlier I mentioned the dorsal vagus nerve. Well, we have this newer nerve called the ventral vagus nerve. And by newer, I mean like 200 million years old instead of 500 million years old. It's also called the wandering nerve because it goes from around the abdominal area up and around your heart and lungs and your ears and your eyes and brain. And it's responsible for making us into the cooperative and social humans that we are now, because we weren't always. And we have survived to the extent that we have as a very successful species, largely because we have evolved to rely on each other. So we are a highly social and cooperative species as a result of this new ventral vagus nerve. So in normally stressful situations, the first instinct is to seek comfort and safety through human connection. We look to our people to help us feel safe, and we call this social engagement. And that's our first line of defense. It's like when we call our friend and say, hey, this stressful thing happened, and hopefully they listen to us and we feel comforted and we calm back down. We go back to our baseline. Yeah, and the activity of actually talking with someone, sitting close to them, looking in their eyes, and maybe touching their hands or holding them, having them hug us, will fill us with feel-good hormones like endorphins and oxytocin. And in this case, the wandering nerve is at work. So those hormones help us calm down and feel safe in the company of our person or people. And our nervous system actually functions better as a result. And so that's what happens when we turn to our people and the response that we get is sufficient. But if we turn to our people and the response we get is not sufficient, our nervous systems become even more upset, more aroused. And we, if we continue to get this response, then over time, our systems will become increasingly more stressed and feel less safe. And under enough stress, we will finally find ourselves in a full-on trauma response. We end up abandoning social engagement, the use of that ventral vagal nerve, and instead employ our sympathetic system for fight or flight tactics. Then, if that still doesn't work and we are too overwhelmed, our dorsal vagus nerve takes over and we go into freeze or collapse and shut down. So, so to say all this again in simple terms, we always automatically first go with the ventral vagus nerve for social engagement. When that doesn't work, we move into sympathetic arousal, which is fight and flight. And then if that doesn't work, we go into dorsal vagal shutdown, which is freeze or collapse.
Well, interesting. It brings it back to the importance of these social engagements, that we hear about so often, about the importance of them in, so many different ways, as older adults, how important it is or whatever. So that's interesting that that's our first line of defense as well. Anyway, continuing on. So is all trauma post-traumatic stress disorder? Can you talk about the differences?
I will answer that. I was hoping first to talk about some examples of trauma response, but would you like me to?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so let me get back to where I was. All right, so so to give some examples of trauma response. So say that you're standing on a street corner and you witness a car accident. Your nervous system will reflexively move into that sympathetic arousal. And let's say in this example, you have a fight response. So your system becomes flooded with cortisol to increase your glucose to your brain, which helps your thinking to be extra sharp. And also you will have a surge of adrenaline to help you move and act quickly. Blood will rush to your heart and limbs, and your lungs will also be pumped with extra oxygen. So in our example, these stress hormones will help you to run quickly to the accident, pull somebody out of a car, call 911, things like that. Ideally, taking that action to get the person safe would discharge the stress hormones from your body, like I was mentioning earlier. And your stress, and your nervous system would then move into parasympathetic response, bringing your arousal back down to baseline. And you would then be calm and good. You may have to, have a little help to get there. Like you may have to call your friend, get some of that social engagement going. And, so you might have to talk about it, walk around, shake a little bit. You may have a good cry over it. All of that to help you discharge. But in that case, you would be okay. You believe the accident victim is safe and you know you're safe and it's all discharged, and so you're good. But let's just say that that wasn't enough to push the stress response out sufficiently for whatever reason. And later that night or later in the week, you might have a startle response at the sound of car brakes, or if somebody drops a glass and it breaks. And you may have trouble sleeping. You may have visual flashes of the accident. So in that case, despite your best efforts, your nervous system is still not feeling safe. The fight response is not all out, and it's still in your nervous system, still in your heart muscle, still in your lungs, still in your limbs, that we're all energized to help you take protective action. And our brains are really quick at making adjustments to help us survive, but it has to really be convinced that conditions are safe before returning to its prior state of arousal, back to baseline. So if the efforts that you took automatically were not enough to discharge the stress hormones, the system will remain somewhat upregulated. And this is trauma. It's the leftover stress response in your body, in your nervous system. And this is why we get flashbacks and headaches and muscle aches and stomach aches, and because it's just still in there. Something did not get finished. And I want to talk right now about a couple of videos that I've seen, which will be shared with you at the end of the chat, at the end in a chat document. So the first one is this video. It's a really great video wherein a polar bear is being tracked by some scientists from a helicopter, and the bear is running. So he's in flight response. Then the scientists dart him with a tranquilizer and he goes down to the ground. It's all very sad, but what's really interesting is that though tranquilized and on the ground, the bear is conscious of the people who are now standing around him. And so he's still in this flight response. And so he continues his running motion, though he's tranquilized and on the ground. So what we see is that his nervous system is discharging his flight response. And then all at once, you see him take these big breaths in and slowly let them out, like these really big breaths, until he finally settles down. So that continued running response, and then the deep breath in, and then that big exhale, that's all discharge. It's all discharge. And so I want to give this other example of collapse from the second video that I saw in a somatic experiencing training. And like I said earlier, collapse is really just intense freeze. So in the second video, there's this impala and it's being chased by a leopard. And suddenly the leopard is upon the impala and the leopard is taking down the impala, and the impala the leopard drags the impala off to the side, and it appears that the impala is dead and the leopard is on top of it. But then the leopard becomes startled by an approaching hyena and the leopard runs off. So then what you see is you realize that this impala is actually not dead, because it suddenly starts doing all this really intense shaking until it finally pops up and runs away. So the collapse was a death feign. So when there was suddenly safety, it went back into the sympathetic arousal and started shaking off all the stress, and then it went into flight, popped up and ran away and got to safety. And I want to say that all mammals have the ability to do this, to like go into a collapse and then come back out of it and recover from it. It's just that with humans, because we have these fancy frontal lobes that do all this second guessing about what we should be experiencing, sometimes we're doing too much thinking and not enough discharging from our body. But we can talk more about that later at the end if we have time. But anyway, both of those videos, I want to reiterate that they will be provided to you in a document that's put in the chat at the end of the presentation.
Thank you for all that. That's interesting. I actually hadn't watched both of the videos yet, so that is really interesting. And I particularly found it interesting that you talked about how, so much of your body is affected physically by what happens with trauma. And, it's just not something I had really thought through. So I'm glad you're explaining it to everyone.
Yeah, and real quick, I forgot to mention that in the video with the leopard and the impala, I couldn't find the full video, but the one that I did find shows the collapse and the shaking, the escape. It just doesn't show the full chase and but it shows enough. You'll get it.
I think so. No, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about is all trauma post-traumatic stress disorder, and if not, can you talk about how they differ and what's different?
Yeah, so we call a trauma response post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, when it meets certain criteria in terms of severity and duration. And acute stress disorder is another common diagnosis after a traumatic event that is less severe than PTSD, but not all trauma is PTSD. Some trauma is worked out efficiently enough, and it does not meet criteria for either PTSD or acute stress disorder. And our example that we talked about with the car accident would cause, for most people, a small or moderate trauma. But say we find out that the driver of the vehicle was a friend and that the friend died. Well, of course, that would surely be a lot to process out very swiftly and would likely leave a residue that would be large enough to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, especially since you would have witnessed the accident. And I do think it's important to say that people are different with different nervous systems and different histories. And what causes PTSD in one person may not cause PTSD in another person. I hope that answers your question.
Do you have a moment to elaborate on that a little bit? Like, why would an incident cause PTSD in me and maybe not in you?
Sure. Yes. So let's just say that let's just say that you know, came into the world like a bit more resourced, or like, let's say I came into the world with a highly sensitive, you know, you've heard this term, highly sensitive people. Some people really just do come into the world with more sensitive nervous systems. So let's say that I came in that way and you came into the world with a little stronger nervous system. And let's just say on top of that, you grew up with more support in your family. And so you grew up feeling, you know, capable, like your nervous system basically became a thing that could really support you through stressful times. Where maybe if I came into the world a bit more sensitive, and then on top of it, I had some traumas to sort through. Well, the way to think of it is like the nervous system is like a container, and those with that come in with tougher or stronger nervous systems are quite as sensitive. It's like they have little bigger containers than people who are highly sensitive. So if you have highly sensitive, and you might have a smaller container, and then if you have a little bit of trauma history already in there, then there's just less capacity than somebody who's got a bigger container and no trauma history. So the more that's in your nervous system, the more there is to deal with. And, you know, that just means the more likely you're going to end up traumatized, like flooded, not able to adequately tolerate or handle and process in a timely manner the stress that gets put into that container that is your nervous system.
Got it. Thank you. Interesting. Okay, we're going to move on. What are some of the signs and symptoms of trauma?
Okay, yeah, so some of the signs and symptoms are things that I'm sure you've heard about, which are sleeplessness, like nightmares about the event, intrusive thoughts and flashbacks, startle response, hypervigilance, maybe trouble concentrating and memory problems, irritability and angry outbursts, body aches, headaches, somatic complaints, shaking, crying a lot, maybe crying uncontrollably, hopelessness, detachment from loved ones and favorite activities, numbing out and dissociation, and feelings of guilt and shame, which I want to talk about for a moment here. Some people after a traumatic event end up having a lot of guilt and shame over the response that was taken. And I want to remind everybody that the responses are automatic. They are not thought out responses. If you're thinking out the response, you've got more going on than just this trauma response, more than the sympathetic arousal. You've got like social engagement is still on board. So trauma responses are lightning fast. So we don't really choose, but people still can feel a lot of guilt and shame over the response that they took. And this is especially true in people who have gone into a freeze state when they've experienced this traumatic event. And it's particularly common, freeze is a particularly common response in children, for example, who are sexually abused, especially when it's by someone they know and trust. So they're used to seeking proximity with the person for safety. They're used to doing that social engagement thing when they're stressed. So they go to this person, but now suddenly this person is violating them. And there's this confusion that happens about whether to run away or fight or stay close that's happening in the nervous system. And so the nervous system ends up going into freeze. And so it's common for people to later feel a lot of guilt and shame over having stayed in a situation where they were being abused. And also for having complicated feelings around the situation, like for having loving feelings toward the person that was abusing you. And this can create a kind of complicated post-traumatic stress reaction. And I want to also say that freeze leaves a person with all that undischarged fight and flight response that came up but was not acted upon because the system shut down. And so this just becomes particularly hard to process out. Yeah.
Thank you for all that. It's a lot. So tell us, how does trauma relate to anxiety and depression?
Yeah, so anxiety is basically excessive worry over something that has happened or that might happen. And depression is basically the experience of carrying around unexpressed emotions that results in a low mood to the point that someone is heavily saddened, hopeless, and disconnected. Both anxiety and depression are experiences of disequilibrium and lack of safety and security. And both anxiety and depression impair executive functioning to some degree, like concentration and memory and all that. So as you may be surmising right now, symptoms of anxiety and depression are very much symptoms of trauma, though trauma symptoms may be more intense. And trauma is known to cause anxiety and depression, and will surely exacerbate any pre-existing anxiety or depression. But that is not to say, however, that all anxiety and depression is rooted in trauma, because that is not correct.
Thanks. That does make sense. So how does all of this relate to cognitive decline?
Okay, so yeah, so as discussed, trauma, which involves anxious and depressive states, can give way to problems with executive functioning, which calls for good memory, attention to detail, planning capabilities, problem solving, etc. And when people are experiencing trauma, their systems are still responding as if the traumatic event is still happening, like we were talking about. And when the system is supporting the parts of the body and brain that are necessary for the trauma response activation, other parts of the body and brain suffer because they are not getting the resources needed for good functioning. Kind of like if you have to pay a big bill this month, you might have to scrimp in other areas of the budget. And so this makes sense because the nervous system is first and foremost concerned about immediate survival and is less concerned with the long term when there is a perceived immediate threat. I hope that makes sense, but I want to go into this little example right here. So we know from research using brain scans on traumatized people that when a person is having a trauma flashback, which is an emotional state, the right hemisphere of the brain, which is the right side is responsible for emotion and creativity, it's all lit up in the scan. So we can see that it's in use. But in the left hemisphere, when that flashback is happening, and the left hemisphere is responsible for logic and language, there is a specific region of the left side of the brain called Broca's area that goes completely offline. And Broca's area is a speech center. It's the part of the brain that helps us put thoughts and feelings into words. And it's actually an area that is affected when someone has had a stroke and the blood supply has been cut off. So we now have evidence that trauma can have the same or similar impact on the brain as does a stroke. And as I talked about earlier, the brain is really good at making adjustments for the sake of survival. And the brain, which is the boss of the nervous system, will not readily go back to what it once was in terms of baseline arousal level functioning. It has to be convinced that all is safe. So after significant trauma has occurred, then the new coping strategies that the brain has taken on to adjust to the new perceived threatening reality needs to get reworked. And that's where trauma therapy might come in. We have to teach the brain and the body that it can safely take different actions, and that all will be well. And social engagement is so important for the brain and for the well-functioning of the complete human being and all mammals, really. We are social creatures, and we've evolved to take care of each other. And we literally need other people for optimal brain function and our overall health and well-being. So when we have trauma impacting our ability to communicate, like we're talking about, because of Broca's area going offline, that's just one example. And then we end up having trouble communicating about ourselves or feelings. It becomes hard to be in social engagement, and things start to go south. So the bottom line is that with trauma, cognitive functioning suffers, executive functioning suffers, social engagement suffers. And the longer the trauma impact goes on, the greater the impairment. There have been many studies indicating that those impacted by trauma and chronic stress or depression are much more likely to suffer from cognitive impairment or decline. And we now have brain scan technology, like we were discussing, that can visually demonstrate how the brain is actually impaired by trauma.
That's a whole lot for me to take in. I don't know about anybody else, but I have learned a lot. So now that you've educated us about trauma and what it is and why it happens, what should we do if we suspect that someone we know or that we are suffering from a trauma-related anxiety or depression?
Yeah, so the healing of trauma is all about working out that unfinished business in the nervous system. And that involves talking out cognitively, what happened, of course. But as I keep saying, what's just as important is working with the nervous system in the body to help us finish discharging that threat response and reworking any coping strategies that we had taken on that helped us at the time of the traumatic event, but maybe are not working so well in our lives right now. So we have to change some of our perspectives on what happened cognitively, and we have to work with the unfinished stress responses in our bodies. And so again, to reiterate it, that the mind holds the trauma, but so does the body. And what's important to note is that when people are traumatized, depressed, or anxious, we tend to hole up, we isolate. And that may be due to our anger or guilt or shame, but we become less social. And isolation is believed to contribute to many diseases, including dementia. And it's thought that since human relationships are the most challenging thing our brains are faced with in life, when in social engagement, our brains are actively exercising, making new synapses, making new brain cells. We're getting a surge of those feel-good hormones that I mentioned earlier. And so if we're isolating, we're not going to get the support we need to process the trauma. We don't get the brain exercise, and our brains start to not fare so well, and our brain activity begins to decline. And this is not to say that it will happen instantly, but it's something to be aware of for the long term. So if you are the one suffering, please talk to someone you trust. If you don't have that person, please do your best to find a professional to talk to, ideally a professional who's been well trained in working with trauma from both talk and body perspectives. And I just want to say that if you're in a crisis and in the DC area, there is the Access helpline, and that phone number will be in the document that I mentioned earlier, as well as the number for the National Suicide Hotline, which is 988. And I want to tell you that some body-centered trauma therapy modalities that you can look for are Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, or SE, it's called SE, Francine Shapiro's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or better known as EMDR, and Pat Ogden's sensory motor psychotherapy. And again, that information will be in that document. Also, things that you can do on your own are yoga, exercise, meditation, breath work, being in nature, which has been shown to greatly reduce stress. And just like we talked about with the polar bear taking those big breaths and slowly letting them out, you can do that too. It's like, that is something that the nervous system spontaneously does when it's moving us into safety. Sometimes we can help ourselves get there by consciously doing that. Also, vibrational humming, like Om chanting with meditation, can feel very silly, but it's actually quite soothing. And I have another video for you that shows a dad helping his baby to fall asleep very easily using that vibrational humming. It's a very sweet video, and it's going to also be in the document. And singing helps too. So if it is someone else you're worried about, try to talk with the person. Sometimes with the aging population, people are starting to isolate more due to medical or mobility issues. Maybe they've lost some friends and family members, and they may be a bit depressed as a result. And this is where it would be good to try to get them to talk, get them into social engagement, help them discharge and not feel so alone. You could take them to a park and just sit in the backyard and look at the trees, see if they will open up and talk. But if you begin to think that there's actually a lot going on with your person, maybe see if they would be willing to let you help them find a professional to talk to. And I want to say that whether it's you or someone else, try to remember that the behavior you may be seeing in yourself or on them is a trauma response attempting to complete itself. Your nervous system is attempting to heal. And if the trauma is big or has been there a while, then you or that person probably needs professional help processing it out. And if your person is experiencing cognitive decline or a brain injury, then try to remember that parts of that person's brain are literally offline. And so there might be some things that are just outside of their control in terms of their behavior. And I want to share with you that I remember when my mother started experiencing Alzheimer's disease, I was really alarmed. It was pretty scary to see the changes coming over her. I felt really confused and sad that my sweet mother was acting the way she was. And I had to talk to some really smart friends of mine and my tias, my aunties, and my therapist to help me remember that part of her brain was not online when she was saying or doing the things she was. And I have to say that Alzheimer's disease put her unhealed trauma on full display. And it was really heartbreaking to watch. And because of her disease, she was not working it out very well. Sometimes all I could do was just hold her while she cried and raged out her pain. And I just had no idea that there was still so much in there from her past. you know, because she was just of that silent generation who valued quiet strength and not talking about vulnerabilities. And I just want to say one more thing in answer to this question, and that is, if I just want to say that if you are in distress and having thoughts of harming yourself, or you believe someone you know might be having thoughts of harming themselves, please do not wait and do get immediate help. There is that national suicide hotline that you can reach by calling 988. But if you believe there is an imminent threat, please contact a local emergency number such as 911, or take yourself or your person to a nearby hospital.
Thank you for all of that. I thought particularly that was really good information and reminders related to Alzheimer's patients, and that, you know, their minds are partially offline. I liked what you said about that. We are going to take questions from the chat. I know there were a few in there already. While I'm just looking at that real quickly, you mentioned several books and audios already. Is there anything else, Annette, that you wanted to share in that vein? I'm so sorry, the sun is kind of shifting in my room here, and I'm shifting myself. But are there any other books and videos that you want to mention, and then we'll get to some questions?
Yeah, no, just my two favorite are The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine. You know, those are my two favorites, but there are lots out there.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to go back through the chat. And Jeanette just mentioned The Body Keeps the Score. Someone also mentioned The Science of Suck.
Yeah, gosh, I haven't read that one.
Yeah, The Science of Stuck. Don't know that one. Anne Marie mentioned that one. Okay, so someone asked if we had a list of trauma specialists. I know that you're in Austin, and that's not something that I have readily available. Is that something that you?
Well, what I would suggest, okay, so I'm trained in SE, somatic experiencing, and I know that there is a directory. If you go to like if you Google somatic experiencing directory, like provider directory, you can find people because it's a national directory. And I feel certain that, you know, other modalities like Pat Ogden's sensory motor psychotherapy, they might have a directory as well, and same with EMDR. But another good source for looking at trauma therapists is the Psychology Today search engine. It's the most widely used place that therapists advertise, and you know, it's got all that. You can put the filters in. You can put somatic in there, or body centered, or something like that, and hopefully find people that will indicate that they are trained in whatever modality.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple questions, and some of them may have been addressed, but I'm just going to go through them. Kate said, I thought freeze was the response of playing dead when the organism determined that was the most effective strategy.
Yes, that is a way to think of it. All of the responses are what the organism thinks are the most effective strategy. Thank you for bringing that up, because again, getting back into that guilt and shame response that can come up in people later, like whatever response your body made you do, that was the right thing to do at the moment. Absolutely. And freeze is staying very still, and collapse is technically the one where you're playing dead, but they're really just the same thing. It's just on a spectrum. They're both down regulation, dorsal vagal shutdown, you know, responses. Good question.
Sure. And Mary Ellen, I think that answered your follow-up question, that freeze, we remain conscious, but still, and collapse, playing dead is when we're unconscious.
Yeah. Yeah. But freeze is like there, but not there. Like you're conscious, but you're not there. Like you're not laying on the ground passed out, but you're checked out. Yeah, and we can talk all day about it. We should.
Yeah, we could have done an all-day program here. Yelena asked about specific symptoms of trauma in older adults. I think we addressed that already, but Yelena, if you had any more specifics, pop that in the chat. Hang
I would
on.
mostly look for, the biggest thing to be concerned about with the elderly is isolation. The elderly, because of multiple reasons, not just trauma, just because of mobility issues, medical issues, losing people, there are just so many reasons that they'll isolate. So like if your person is just holding up, like reach out, like, go see them, talk to them, try to get them out, take them places, take them for an ice cream. Yeah.
So Janine put in the chat, just want to make sure you all saw it, for trauma providers, EMDRIA or Trauma Research Foundation. And then Yelena asked, what about hoarding?
Yeah,
Does
I
that-
mean, hoarding is, I don't know if that's it could be, I mean, I don't know if it's a trauma reaction. I don't know enough about hoarding, but I do know that it's something that becomes more common in the elderly. I've known people that have had trauma that have hoarded, but like I said, I can't speak to that because I'm not an expert in hoarding. But I know that it does happen and that people become more likely to do hoarding as they get older. And I think hoarding could be an effect, could be an outcome of cognitive decline. I don't know. I'm sorry. I wish I could answer that. I can look into it and get back to you.
And just one other question that came through, and then if anyone else has questions, just pop them in the chat. I think I've gotten all the other ones, is if you've experienced trauma as like a younger person, whether it's a child or a teenager, can that like really sit with you all through your life if you don't, as you said, sort of complete it?
Yes, it can do that. But what I want to say is that we're designed to heal. Like the nervous system wants to heal. It's just that we identify all these symptoms in people. Like we see people lashing out, acting out, making bad choices in their lives when we don't understand why they're doing that. The system is trying to work something out. So the stance that I like to take when I see people that are acting out and doing destructive things is to remember that is a person who is attempting to heal. We are all attempting to heal, but sometimes we just need help. The body, the mind want to heal. So yes, it can stay with you, but it absolutely does not have to.
Got it. And then just two other questions we'll take, and then we will wrap up. Beth says, my patients tell me living in a nursing home is their trauma. Can this be significant trauma?
Yeah, I think that can be significant trauma because they've been, removed from their home. They're maybe, again, they have mobility issues. They can't get themselves out. They might feel trapped. They might feel, shut down. What it's making me think about is if there's no way for them to escape, like they might be having like a flight response that they cannot complete. But there are ways to work with the elderly to help them discharge that flight response. This could get into a really long conversation, but I want to encourage you to maybe get some consultation with a, of course, like I've been trained in SE, and so that's the framework that I'm coming from. But I encourage you to find somebody to take consultation with where you can talk about this at length, because if I had somebody in my office talking about this, I could definitely come up with some things to try with clients that were feeling trapped and therefore traumatized in the nursing home.
Got it. Thank you. Last question from Deborah. What about historical trauma and its impact on cognitive decline?
Yeah, so historical trauma, I'm assuming that, do you mean generational trauma? Like, do you mean from like family of origin, like from your life, or from prior generations? I'm unclear.
Deborah, do you want to elaborate on that? Augusta also said, added, and generational trauma. Hang on one second.
I saw slavery, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really, really good question. We know from the field of epigenetics that again, we don't have enough time to go into the background of epigenetics, but the book to read here for that is My Grandmother's Hands. I strongly encourage you to read My Grandmother's Hands. It's by Resmaa Menakem. I can't remember exactly how to say his last name.
Is that My Grandmother's Town?
Hands. My Grandmother's Hands.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It's a really good book, but it addresses exactly that. But yes, because of the field of epigenetics, we know that trauma can be passed down generation to generation. The unhealed trauma can be passed down. So yes, it absolutely can be. But again, it can be worked with because the body wants to heal.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a good way to end, that the body wants to heal. Thank you all so much. Annette, thank you for this really interesting discussion. We truly could have gone on for, I think, a lot longer. As I said, we did record this. We will have it in our resources page on our website. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the links that Annette mentioned in her presentation of those videos and some other information. You will have that survey in there to complete for your continuing education credit. I also encourage you, there'll be a link to our next upcoming program on March 22nd. It's about substance abuse in older adults, and you can always check our website for other upcoming programs, smithlifecommunities.org. Our annual healthcare symposium on May 11th was just put on the website and is active for registration. Thank you all for being with us. Annette, thank you so much for such a wonderful
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure. I hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Be well.